Marilyn Monroe's ex-roommate Clarice Evans explains why Marilyn, Norma Jean Baker, broke up with Joe Dimaggio, what turned her into the kind of woman who puts personal success ahead of everything else, even love. A girl who knew her intimately seeks the answer in her lonely, heartbreaking childhood. I hinted at certain character traits which might partly explain the quick disintegration of her marriage with Joe Dimaggio. Frankly, the Marilyn I knew at the Hollywood Studio Club prepared me more for the breakup than for the marriage itself. Actually, I didn't believe the columns when they began taking Joe and Marilyn seriously. In our girlish bowl sessions at the Studio Club, Marilyn, whose eyes were already aglow with the dream of footlights, told me she didn't want to get married for at least 10 years. She had set aside a decade to give her all-consuming career a chance to ripen. At the end of that time, she would willingly give up glory for the right man. Marilyn also was very specific about wanting 4 children, 2 of her own and 2 orphans, to whom she wanted to give the advantages she had never enjoyed. I wasn't prepared for the news of Marilyn's marriage because I felt that, with her background, her career must always win out over love. You won't know what I'm talking about unless you understand her childhood, a desolating ricochet from orphanage to foster home. It was during that loveless stretch in her life that this little blonde waif realized her only security lay in herself and what she could accomplish. That is why the grown-up Marilyn Monroe today is systematically organized for a career rather than for marriage. Now don't get me wrong. I don't fancy myself an armchair strategist on marital battles. I'm as ignorant as you of what happened inside the 4 walls of the Dimaggio Monroe residence. But as her ex-roommate, I do know that Marilyn's matrimonial troubles began through no fault of her own before her hair was in pigtails. The tragedy is that America's sweetheart was never anybody's little girl. Her mother, who was too ill to care for her, hardly ever saw her. Her father was killed in an auto accident. The only real parent Marilyn ever knew was Los Angeles County. Like an unwanted bundle, Norma Jean Baker, that was her real name, was shipped from family to family on approval. Even though most of the army of legal guardians were good and kind, their little boarder learned early in life to be self-sufficient. In the painful conversations we had about her childhood, Marilyn could scarcely remember all the places she had lived. The first dimly recalled roof over her head was in Hawthorne, California. Her parents there moved east when Marilyn was 5. She was then farmed out to a family of British actors who were playing bit parts in Hollywood. From them, the scrawny blonde tyke picked up a slight British accent, as well as a precocious flair for knife-throwing and juggling Indian clubs. 2 years later she was delivered to the door of a Hollywood studio worker and his wife. They lived in a big house on a hill. But there were no children around, and for companionship Marilyn relied on a collection of rare birds. This too proved to be a temporary sanctuary. At 9 Marilyn ended up in the Los Angeles Orphans' Home. The superintendent, a Mrs. Dewey, was wonderful and sweet. But her affection had to be meted out in thin slices to scores of love-starved boys and girls. Even the tiniest crumb of attention made an indelible impression on Marilyn, though. It was during this stay at the orphanage. She told me that 2 thrilling things happened. One was her first job helping in the pantry and setting tables at 5 cents a month. The second was the day Mrs. Dewey delighted Marilyn by dusting a little powder on her face. Such a small and trifling gesture of affection, one in a daily dozen for most kids, became a treasured once-in-a-lifetime memory for a little girl whom nobody had ever noticed. After a few months in the institution, she was boarded out to a family living in the San Fernando Valley. They were succeeded by a family consisting entirely of women, a great-grandmother, a grandmother, a mother, and 3 daughters. The daughter, of Los Angeles County, upset the balance even more, and her stay in this matriarchy was short. Then came the most important event in my future roommate's young life. She told me about it one afternoon when we were riding in her convertible. She was driving over to take a lesson from Natasha Lightis, her longtime dramatic coach. I had gone along for the ride. Marilyn, always philosophical but seldom confidential, suddenly poured out her heart to me as never before. Only one person in the world that I've ever really loved, she said. That was Aunt Anna. Oh, she wasn't my real aunt. Her name was Anna Lower. She lived on the wrong side of the tracks in West Los Angeles. I was billeted with her for 2 years. She was the only person who ever gave me love. And a feeling of warmth and affection. I could be myself with her if I had to and tell her why. She'd put her arms around me and give me a kiss. Aunt Anna was surer than I am now that I was right in my ambition to be an actress and that I'd be a success. But she'll never know whether she was right or wrong. She died before my first bit part. My roommate, already a budding young starlet, came closer to tears at that instant than ever before or afterward in our relationship. Obviously, Aunt Anna's self-appointed niece, now twice orphaned, would never forget that loss. By the time I knew her, Marilyn still unconsciously betrayed the vacuum in her early life by appropriating other people's parents for herself. One day, looking out of the window of our room at the studio club, I saw my father drive up. To attract his attention, I leaned out and called, "Daddy." My efforts produced no results. Seized by an impulse that must have welled up in her all during her childhood, Marilyn suddenly leaned out and shouted, "Daddy," much more resoundingly than I had. She beamed when he looked up and gave her a hearty wave. She was also deeply touched by little kindnesses that mothers ordinarily heap on daughters. Once Iffy mother, who was visiting me in California, received a request by mail from my sister for a scarf of a certain color and style. The closest match was a hem-it yourself item of imported material. My mother spent hours in our room hemming it for my sister. Marilyn was amazed. "It's so wonderful of your mother," she marveled, "to fix a scarf for your sister with her own hands when she could buy almost the same thing ready-made." The misty look in her eyes spoke volumes. There were other ways in which her empty girlhood still echoed when foreknew her. To cite one minor instance, Marilyn probably got more phone calls than any girl at the Hollywood Studio Club, but she almost never got any mail. While other girls would gather at the mail desk happily tearing open packages and reading snatches of their family's letters to all who would listen, Marilyn would be on the outside looking in, silent, envious, and, I'm afraid, hurt. Unfortunately, school did not provide warm friends to compensate for Marilyn's lack of parents. During the illness of Aunt Anna, the county ward was again sent packing to at least 2 other strange houses. Whatever scant belongings she had were carted around in a dog-eared suitcase made of cheap blue cardboard. Marilyn's popularity with other girls at high school was not helped much by the fact that she owned only 2 changes of clothes, a pair of identical maiden-in-uniform type blouses and skirts. At 15, still lonely and practically friendless, Marilyn again faced the dreary prospect of being sent back to the orphanage. It was as a rather desperate escape measure that she got married instead to James Doherty, now a policeman in Van Nuys, California. The marriage was unhappy and short-lived. Marilyn once admitted to me that Di had regarded James more as a brother than a mate. But she realized the seriousness of marriage and tried hard to make a go of it by keeping house and cooking. She told me her husband was resentful and overly jealous if other men noticed her. One day, for instance, his best friend came to visit. Since her husband wasn't home, Marilyn didn't dare invite the friend into the house. They both sat outside on the porch until James arrived. That was the only glimpse Marilyn ever gave me of her first marriage. I believe she preferred to forget that the whole thing had ever taken place. Now, what have the circumstances of this girl's youth got to do with the breakup of her marriage of the century to Joe Dimaggio? Just this: Marilyn had no training in love of one individual for another. She was and is devoted to the one surefire source of satisfaction that has saved her from obscurity and won her the affections of millions: her acting career. As I said before, Marilyn was systematically organized for success, as one look at her appointment book would bear out. Whenever it came to a sacrifice between her career and anything else she might do without, she chose her career. When Marilyn's money got low, she'd stop buying clothes and shampoo her own hair. She even moved from the Hollywood studio club to cheaper quarters. But under no circumstances would she ever dream of cutting down on the singing, dancing and acting lessons which filled her every day and which were her hope for success. The very quality that catapulted Marilyn to the pinnacle of fame was what got in the way of her marriage to that other loner Joe Dimaggio. Even if Marilyn wanted to with all her heart, I doubt whether at this juncture she could give up her quest for acting laurels. It's been a part of her too long and she has worked too hard to establish herself. Who can completely blame her? Love has been a stranger to her all her life. But the stage, and its substitute for love, the adulation of millions that has never failed her, fame demands a price, and Marilyn Monroe has paid it with Hollywood's customary forfeit, a broken heart and a lover who has gone away forever. The end.